Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Mark. If I'm audible,
Yeah, you are.
I will begin. And thanks to Liz and to Russell as well for having me, and everyone for attending today. So yes, my name's Oliver. It's been a few years since I did my MA. I've gone in a slightly different direction now, but I'm still very much interested in the Crusades and the Knights Templar. And I hope I'll be able to inspire and interest you about this, what I consider to be a very interesting subject. This is a general account of what we know as the Knights Templar, or if you want to use the fancy long name, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. A general history of approximately 200 years for the most part. And I will try, with time allowed, have a look at what they were doing specifically in Britain. The Order of the Knights Templar has a pretty prominent place in public imagination. It's generally understood to have been quite a mysterious group originating in the Middle Ages, which got very powerful and wealthy before suddenly being violently suppressed by the church. This assessment is broadly correct, but the alleged mysteriousness of the Templars has been largely shaped by interpretations created since they were suppressed. These interpretations have often been pseudo-historical and have shaped a popular modern understanding of the Templars, which is quite incorrect, I have to say. So what I'd like to do is try to focus tonight on the real history of the Templars for the most part. That is what we know from the historical source material and from the work of scholars as well about them. But we'll also have a look at the end at some of the pseudo history as well and how that came to be. But before we even begin to examine the history of the Templars, we need to just look at the circumstances which brought about their creation. So I put a map here for you. 1095, the year is. This is a highly simplified political map of Southern Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Muslim world at that time. So at this time, what we're looking at, the Roman Empire had once covered probably the majority of it, but it had long broken apart by this time. However, its legacy was still relevant. The old western part of the empire, which had comprised what we can see as France, Spain, part of what's now Germany, of course, Italy, had fragmented. It was now ruled under various kingdoms, which I've sort of put the rough borders of them, but it's very, very simplified. Religiously, it was Catholic Christian under the ecclesiastical suzerainty of the Pope, the papacy in Rome. And then you had the eastern part of the old Roman Empire, which was ruled from Constantinople, which I put an arrow there, which is now Istanbul in Turkey. When the Western Roman Empire had broken up, the Eastern Empire had survived as a coherent entity. We now know it as the Byzantine Empire because Constantinople had originally been called Byzantium. It was also Christian, but Orthodox Christian, not Catholic, so it didn't answer to the Pope, unlike Western Christendom. And of course, religious differences between West and East caused much disagreement and tension between the two. By the time we're looking at, the Byzantine Empire had shrunk to a small fraction of its former size. The reason for this is that in the beginning in the 7th century AD, the religion of Islam had emerged, rapidly spreading outward from the Arabian Peninsula and conquering new territories at an alarming speed. Many of the areas conquered by the Muslims had once been part of this Eastern or Byzantine Empire. The Muslims had gone across North Africa as well and even reached Western Europe, taking over much of Spain at this point. This has caused great upheaval for Christendom. So in the year 1095, we see a rough frontier between Christendom and the Muslim world. And that frontier is not just the Mediterranean Sea, but also areas like Spain and the Byzantine Empire as well. So with this in mind, it was in that, the reason I've chosen that date was because it was in that year that the Pope, called Urban II, called a church council in France at a place called Clement to discuss reforming the Catholic Church. It was at this council that Pope Urban would issue a call for the Christians of Western Europe to undertake what we now know as a crusade to the Holy Land. Earlier that same year, 1095, the Pope had received ambassadors from the Byzantine Empire who had asked if military help could be sent to help them against the Muslims. The Pope, having received these ambassadors, wanted to take advantage of this opportunity. He wanted to bring the Byzantine Church, which was Orthodox Christian, more into the fold of the Catholic Church. And he wanted them to recognize his supremacy. So answering this call and marshalling some kind of military enterprise to help the Byzantines seemed like a good pretext to assert papal authority, and the way he would see it, smoothing over some of the disagreements that had been going on over the previous centuries. The other main reason for calling crusade was, of course, the recovery of the Holy Land, which is why the Byzantine Empire sent these emissaries to the Pope. The recovery of the Holy Land, namely Jerusalem, Christianity's holy city, from Muslim control. I say here recovery as the Holy Land, including Jerusalem, had once been controlled by the Christian Byzantine Empire before the Muslim invasions. It had once been Roman, and then it had been Eastern Roman or Byzantine, and then it became Muslim. So the idea was to also retake these areas that had once been Christian. Another reason Pope Urban called a crusade was to divert violence away from political infighting in Europe and channel it into fighting against the Muslims. As the spiritual head of the church in Western Europe, uniting the heads of the leaders of Catholic Western Christendom in this way was another means of asserting papal authority over his flock in Western Europe and stopping people from fighting each other. So, and lastly, in return for going on crusade, the Pope offered spiritual incentives, which promised a remission of sins for those that set out. So their sins committed would be sort of absolved, and they have a speedier entrance into heaven and instant martyr's reward for those who actually died whilst on crusade. So we have a mixture of political, military, religious reasons for this enterprise, which was not known at that time as a crusade, but an armed pilgrimage, what we now know as a crusade. Long story short, it was Pope Urban's speech that inaugurated what we now know as the First Crusade. The story of the First Crusade would merit an entire lecture by itself, but the salient points are that various armies from Europe, led by a coalition of various leaders from Western Europe, made their way overland across southeastern Europe, heading for Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Once at Constantinople, the plan was for the armies to convene with the Byzantines, with the Byzantine emperor, and to cooperate with his forces to march out of Constantinople across what's now Turkey, Anatolian Peninsula, heading for Jerusalem, and to retake these lands from the Muslims in cooperation with the Byzantines, culminating eventually, hopefully, in the capture of Jerusalem itself. And despite many, many years of fighting and terrible hardships through famine and disease and sieges, the Crusaders finally managed to capture the city of Jerusalem, which itself fell in July of the year 1099. So this was a long period of time. Really, they first set out in 1096 it was, and they didn't capture Jerusalem until 1099. This is a Romantic era 19th century depiction of the Crusaders' capture of Jerusalem. The First Crusade was a success, obviously, as they captured Jerusalem, in part because of the persistence of the Crusaders in the face of hardship and the assistance of the Byzantines. They would also have attributed their success as well to divine assistance, of course, from God. Part of this success, though, was also due to the fact that the Muslim world was fragmented at this time. It was not one coherent entity. There was no unified Muslim leader to oppose them. And these divisions had weakened the response of the Muslims against the Crusade. They were fragmented. However, this being done and Jerusalem and the Holy Land being retaken for Christianity, the Crusaders were left in quite a perilous, precarious position at this point. After Jerusalem had been captured, many of the surviving Crusaders that there were left returned home. The ones remaining had to consolidate their control of Jerusalem by establishing some sort of government to establish some kind of foothold here so they wouldn't be instantly kicked out as soon as they'd arrived. And this is the eventual result of that consolidation, a number of political states that were set up by the Crusaders to manage the territories that they'd captured in the First Crusade. These were governed by a minority European population of settlers, while being mainly populated by native peoples, both Muslim and Eastern Christian groups. Some historians have likened this to a kind of early colonization. Historians called these territories the Crusader states. They've also been called the Latin East, or in Old French, Outre-mer, which means lands across the sea. Their European sort of ruling class inhabitants are often known as Franks, which is a sort of catch-all term which alludes to the domination of French-speaking peoples in this European group. French-speaking peoples from France and French-speaking areas made up a disproportionately large numbers of these settlers. These Crusader states lasted in some form or another for about 200 years, and their existence was marked not just by war, but also by periods of peace, trade, commercial prosperity, and truces, and sometimes even alliances with Muslim forces. Officially, the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the south was the most important state, with the others being subordinate territories ruled by a mixture of princes and counts. It was important for the Crusader states to work together for their survival, as the surrounding Muslim political entities were often hostile. To the east, the main Muslim centers were Aleppo and Damascus. To the southwest was Egypt, which was another major Muslim power. Although the Crusaders employed native Christian troops to supplement their forces to help defend themselves, there was always a chronic shortage of manpower available to the Franks, which made their presence in this region always precarious. So they were always, a lot of the time they were on the defensive, they had a shortage of manpower that would fight for them. And this is a really important thing to consider when we come on to the founding of the Knights Templar. The city of Jerusalem was the administrative capital of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem. This was the political and spiritual center for the Christians in the Holy Land. The photograph you can see here shows the Temple Mount, which is located in the old city of Jerusalem. This is the site where the Jewish Temple of Solomon once stood, and it's a holy place for Christians, Muslims, and Jews. This site, along with various other places in Jerusalem, such as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and various other sites across the Holy Land, was a focal point for pilgrims who came from the West. After all, one of the consequences of the First Crusade, now that this area was in Christian control, was that Christian pilgrims could more safely visit these holy sites. They had been able to at periods under the Muslims, but now it was easier and safer or theoretically, for Christians to visit these holy places. However, any pilgrim wishing to travel to Jerusalem would usually have to travel by sea to a port like Jaffa, which is marked by the red point on this map, and would have to journey inland from there. That would be probably the quickest option, about 40 miles or so from there to inland to Jerusalem. The English pilgrim Cywulf visited Jerusalem in the year 1102, very shortly after the First Crusade. He described making the arduous pilgrimage route from Jaffa to Jerusalem by mountainous road, with any unarmed pilgrims or travelers being vulnerable to attacks by raiders. So he says we went from Joppa or Jaffa to the city of Jerusalem journey of about 2 days by mountainous road, very dangerous on account of the Saracens who lie in wait in the caves to surprise the Christians. So this was a big problem. There were these political entities. Theoretically, Christian pilgrims should be able to visit the Holy Land, visit the holy sites, but there was always a chronic shortage of manpower to defend them. So what to do? So pilgrims needed to be protected when traveling. And in addition to that, the Crusader states needed military protection as well for both, defensive and offensive campaigns. So about 20 years after the First Crusade had taken place, a particular pious French knight called Hugh de Payne, of whom we know relatively little, decided to form a brotherhood or a confraternity of knights dedicated to protecting Jerusalem, the holy places and pilgrims from attacks by the Muslims. These knights would dedicate all of their time fighting not for personal power or wealth, but for purely spiritual, religious reasons to protect the pilgrims and the holy sites. So Hugh de Payne and his small group of companions went to the king of Jerusalem at this time, who was called Baldwin II, around 1118 or so, and proposed his plan. King Baldwin, along with the Patriarch of Jerusalem, who was the ecclesiastical leader in Jerusalem, approved and allowed Hugh to institute a new religious group, which would become known as the Knights Templar. The recognition of this new order was enacted in the year 1120, and this is a manuscript illumination of Hugh de Payne meeting King Baldwin. Sometime around that point, King Baldwin gave Hugh de Payne and his new order its headquarters, which was situated on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, at the site of the former Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is pictured here. The Muslims had built this mosque in the 7th century, shortly after capturing Jerusalem, so it had been in use by about 400 years by the time the Crusaders captured it. As previously mentioned, the Temple Mount is regarded as the place where King Solomon had once built his temple. The association of this area with Solomon's temple remained relevant to the Christian Crusaders, and this is where the Templars took their name from. Before going on to chart the growth and the story of the Templars, we should briefly consider the significance of this new idea that Hugh de Payne had instituted. Medieval society distinguished between those who fought and those who prayed. So those who prayed were not supposed to do any fighting. However, due to the pressing needs of the time, Hugh de Payne had set up a group of knights whose main purpose was to fight for God and for the defense of Christians in the Holy Land. So these knights were supposed to forswear personal possessions and devote themselves entirely to the faith, rather like how a monk would. However, their vocation, which is very unlike that of a monk, of course, was to fight. So how would we reconcile these apparently conflicting ideas? Members of the Knights Templar had to take the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, which was kind of like how a monk would have to take these vows. They were known as brothers, and they lived communally. In their daily lives, they followed a rule, which means a set of instructions on how a religious order should live. This rule was modeled on similar rules used by other religious orders, such as the Benedictines and the Cistercians, which were monastic orders. It was very strict, this rule, and it mandated a very austere and very Spartan, minimal lifestyle. Like monks, Templars had to observe the canonical hours, which means they had to pray at various points of the day like monks, such as matins and vespers and all these other divine offices throughout the day. So you can see on the top right, these are the kinds of things that mark the Templars out as being like monks. And then on the other hand, like warriors, unlike monks, they did not spend their time cloistered away in contemplation, for example, and reading or writing. In fact, many of them couldn't actually read or write. They were relatively uneducated, which was distinct from monks generally. The Templars' calling was warfare, and as such, they trained as warriors. To keep them in good physical condition, to allow them to practice with their arms and to do all the rigorous training and the fighting that they needed to be doing, they were allowed certain things that monks weren't. So they were allowed to eat more meat, for example, and forego the fasting, for example, that monks would have to go through in order to keep their strength up and allow them to carry out what they needed to do. So you see this kind of what would have been at the time very strange harmonizing between these two concepts of monks and warriors to create so-called sort of warrior monks. But of course, although they were warriors, the Templars had to always were mindful of the fact that they were not allowed to fight against. They were only allowed to fight against the enemies of God. So, unlike normal warriors, they had a holy vocation. The nascent Templar order was helped during the early years of its existence by the patronage of a man called Bernard of Clairvaux, who was one of the major figures in the founding of the Cistercian monastic order. He was a kind of public relations and marketing agent for the Templars, really. He composed a treatise in the 1120s or 30s called In Praise of the New Knighthood, which was a kind of propaganda piece. So in it, he reconciled these kind of two warrior monk vocations, and he lauded the role of these new hybrid warrior monks. He explained how the Templars contrasted markedly with normal knights of the time, how the Templars would be selfless, God-fearing, humble, and austere, in contrast with normal knights, normal warriors who were often criticized for pride, vice, and impiety largely. So Bernard emphasizes the Templars as a new knighthood of a kind not seen before. Warriors who were prepared to dedicate their lives and die as a community, fighting for the faith against the enemies of Christendom rather than against other secular Christian knights. Summing up their dual pious and militaristic nature, Bernard described them at once as being both gentler than lambs yet fiercer than lions. And Bernard's influence and patronage would be very helpful in drawing support and patronage for the Templars in their formative years. During the very, very early years of its existence, the Templar order remained relatively poor and humble. The image which I've put in the top right corner of this slide of two knights on one horse was supposed to symbolize how poor they were, implying that at the beginning of their existence, they had to share one horse between two knights. And you can see this image on some things like Templar seals for documents, for example. However, it didn't take too long before the Templars attracted a lot of support. For one thing, they received official papal recognition in the year 1129. The Pope gave them special privileges, which greatly increased their power. Under these privileges, the order could build their own churches, have their own cemeteries, have exemption from church tithes, were allowed to take their own monetary collections, and enjoyed other various rights and privileges. Beginning in the 1140s, they were also permitted to wear their famous red cross, which I've shown here. So they were beginning to function, or there were a series of papal mandates that gave them more and more rights and made them into more and more of a sort of autonomous group operating almost sort of separately from the rest of the church. And they were sort of really only accountable to the Pope in this respect. They were granted a lot of exemptions from paying money to, say, the local bishop. And so they were started to enjoy a lot of power very quickly. Support also came from outside of the church. Kings, queens, nobles, and normal regular people across the Crusader states and Europe donated money and land to the Templars. This allowed the Templars to establish themselves, start to build their assets and finance their activities, which were ultimately supposed to be the protection of pilgrims and the holy sites. These people, why did these people, ordinary people, donate to the Templars? They donated sort of largely for the salvation of their own souls, rather like they would give money or land to any other religious order, like the Benedictine monks, for example. It was also a way for the ordinary person to, say in Europe, to contribute in some way financially towards the defense of the Crusader states and to help everything that the Templars were doing. So once they were established, what were the Templars doing on an everyday basis? As we've seen, the Templars were not cloistered away in contemplation like monks. They were fundamentally practical men who turned their piety to practical purposes. They constituted a constant military presence in the Crusader states, a bit like a standing army. To a lesser extent, they were also active fighting against Muslims in Spain, but the Crusader states was by far their most important area of operations. During the Crusader states' lifespan of about 200 years or so, there would be various castles built, campaigns fought, and land changing hand between Christians and Muslims, and alliances formed and broken. And every so often during this time, a new crusade would be called in Europe, often in response to some kind of setback in the Crusader states. And if that happened, fresh troops would sail from Europe to provide assistance and manpower. So, for example, the Third Crusade, which was the one with King Richard the Lionheart, was called in response to a great setback in the Crusades, in the Crusader states. In that case, it was the fall of the capture of Jerusalem by the Muslims by the Muslim general Saladin in the year 1187. So, when these crusades would be formed sporadically throughout the 1100s and the 1200s in response to some kind of setback, often in the Crusader states. Not always due to a setback, but often. Throughout this entire period, the Templars were always there, a constant presence in the Crusader states. They were an elite fighting force, and of course, they were essential to address the chronic shortage of manpower in the Crusader states. They were reliable soldiers because they were bound by their vocation to stay in the Holy Land, rather than going to and fro like the Crusaders might appear, do a campaign, or fight a crusade and then go back home, whereas the Templars would stay put. For this reason, the Templars were often given castles to garrison, or indeed they built their own castles, which they could do because of their relative autonomy. You can see in the picture one of the principal castles that they built, called Chateau Pellerin, which is on the coast of what's now northern Israel. Templars were given large swathes of land to govern and protect. They contributed troops to whenever the king of Jerusalem or the other Crusader states needed troops. And of course, whenever a crusade was launched from Western Europe, they would be there to assist the arriving Crusaders, using their experience of being in the Holy Land to provide advice and support. In addition to this, certain members of the Knights Templar served in various roles as royal servants, or we might say civil servants in some way, advising on government administration. For example, a number of Templars held the post of royal almoner to the kings of both England and France. And some Templars were recruited for jobs like tax collection, diplomatic missions, things like that, which was reflective of not just their power going through the 1100s and 1200s, not just their growing power, but also the immense trust that was placed in them by the rulers across Europe, as well as the Crusader states. Another service that the Templars provided was to offer secure places of deposit for people to leave valuables and money, particularly kings and nobles and wealthy merchants. The Temple Church in London, which I will come on to in a minute, is an example of such a place. The Templars also advanced loans. They probably issued charges for late repayments on these loans, which was one of the ways they would have made profit on advancing these loans, because technically they were prohibited by canon law, which is church law, from charging interest on the loans, which was prohibited as usury for Christians to do. So this was one of the loopholes in which they probably made money on advancing loans. And because of, as I mentioned, the immense degree of trust that was placed in the Templars by rulers across Europe, they were sometimes given the job of acting as trustees or some kind of neutral or intermediary party in negotiations. Technically, they were supposed to be impartial to the needs, to the loyalty of one particular ruler, because they were a pan-European Middle Eastern organization. So theoretically, they were supposed to be trusted people that were relatively impartial. That didn't necessarily work out to be the case always, but theoretically they were supposed to be. So they were often trusted as intermediaries in this for negotiations. One example would be when the Templars held some castles in trust during negotiations between the French and English kings. So I'll just briefly go over the organization of the order of the Temple. At the top, you had the Grand Master. This was an elected official who was in command of the entire order. He was elected for life by a kind of assembly or electoral college of other Templars. And all but 2 of the Grand Masters, I believe, served their terms fully before dying. Many of them actually died in battle against the Muslims. So these were hands-on people. You know, they were very much active in everything that was going on, militarily as well as politically. The Marshal was the chief military official under the Grand Master. He was a kind of deputy or second in command. And then under that, you had other various offices like the treasurer, draper, steward. They all had various administrative, logistical, economic, administrative, military responsibilities. And then you had provincial masters, which were a kind of submaster arranged regionally. So there were various provinces. The areas that the Templars controlled were divided into various provinces, and these were controlled by various officials. So, for example, you had maybe a master in England, which was one Templar province, one in what's now Germany, various regions of the French kingdom and Spain as well, and Christian Spain as well, and also in the provincial masters in the Crusader states. And then going down to the smallest unit of administration, you had what's called commanderies or preceptories, which were the lowest level of local Templar sort of government. Really, they were scattered across the various lands that the Templars had. So the lands that the Templars acquired or were donated would have commanderies or preceptories in command of them, and these would be headed by commanders or preceptors. So that's the sort of a brief view on the organization. As to the kind of Templar brothers that there were, you might be familiar with the image of Templar knights who wore a white mantle with a red cross on it. They tended to be drawn from the more noble or wealthy classes of society. They had to have their horse, because they tended to function as the cavalry or the heavy cavalry of the Templar armies in the Crusader states. So they would, like other knights, they were generally drawn from the higher classes of society. But you also had Templar sergeants. They wore a black or brown mantle a mantle being a kind of sort of covering over your torso. They wore a sort of brown or black mantle with a red cross as well. They were brothers from the more common ranks of society, and these were the rank and file foot soldiers of the Templar armies. And they also did auxiliary work as well, and all the manual work that that Templar brothers might need to do in the field while on campaign, for example, and for just general maintenance like building, carpentry, farrowing the horses, construction, etc. Templar chaplains were the only Templar brothers who were ordained. In fact, their job was to do things like conduct mass and administer the sacraments. So they fulfilled the religious functions for their fellow Templar brothers. And then in addition, you had various associates like mercenaries that were employed by the Templars to supplement their forces, and other people that did work for them, like manual labor and things like that, who maybe were not professed Templar brothers, but they were in some way associated with the Templars. So there were two sides to the Templars' activities. In the Crusader states, we've looked at how they functioned as an army, castle garrison, etc. But much of the money that the Templars needed to finance their activities in the East came from their properties in Europe. These properties comprised buildings and land, and the order ran them basically as estate landlords to generate revenue. This revenue came from both rents from tenants and from any produce that was grown or reared on the land. A third of the profits from these revenues was theoretically supposed to go east towards helping to finance the order, and then the rest would presumably be on upkeep of these properties. In Britain, the Templars started acquiring land and property early on, from about the 1130s, so not that long after the Templars were formed. One of their early land acquisitions was at Cressing in Essex, between Colchester and Chelmsford. This was gifted to them in the 1130s by Matilda, the wife of King Stephen, not to be confused with Matilda, the cousin of King Stephen, who was King Stephen's enemy. But in any case, Cressing was one of the largest estates of the Templars in Britain. And here you can see one of the barns, actually, that was used, the surviving barns, grade 1 listed, which was used for storing grain at Cressing. The Templars came to hold numerous other properties, particularly in England. Some of the most lucrative revenues from their properties came from places like Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Herefordshire, Gloucestershire, and Leicestershire, where they farmed a lot of sheep. They were good at sheep farming, and so they made profits, for example, on the wool that came from that. But they also oversaw arable farming as well. They took revenues from the growing of various cereals and peas and other crops. In addition to England, they also held a few modest properties on the Celtic periphery, so in Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, to a lesser extent, but mainly in the British Isles, mainly it was in England. But I'd like to spend a bit of time just talking about London, because of course a talk for this society on the Templars wouldn't be complete without looking at what they did in the city of London. By the late 1130s or the 1140s, the Templars acquired a site at Holborn, which is near the site of the current Lincoln's Inn. There they built a church, which is now known as the Old Temple, but they didn't use it for long, as the site was sold in the 1160s, and a new temple church called the New Temple, which you can see in this photograph, was constructed about half a mile to the south of the Old Temple, which the Old Temple doesn't exist anymore. It was pulled down. This is the New Temple, which was away from the old one. As you can see in this photograph, you can also see there the two knights on the one horse on the pillar there, which is a later construction. The nave of the church, which is the round building in the photo, was the first part of the church to be constructed, and the other rectangular part to the right of it was built probably about a century afterwards. This round nave is significant because it was a feature of many Templar-built churches and some non-Templar-built churches as well. And what it did was it imitated the circular rotunda of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at Jerusalem, which is reputed to be the place where Christ was buried. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, sepulchre meaning a tomb. So this was sort of an imitation of that, and this was significant. And it's why you'll see some Templar churches have this round nave. As to the functions of the Temple Church, it was used as a place of worship by the brothers and was probably sometimes open to the public, actually, for worship as well. It would have been important as an administrative centre for meetings and such. As already mentioned, Templars were involved in financial activities, so people could deposit valuables here, deposit money, and even in the 12th and 13th centuries, it even came to serve as a kind of unofficial royal treasury. Taxation revenue could be stored there, as it was at times, and it even served as a kind of archive store for the government, with various rolls of parchment rolls, for example, exchequer rolls being stored there at some time or another. Clearly, this reflects the immense trust that the Templars had as safekeepers of valuable items, including for the crown and for the government. The London Temple Church was one of a number of places of deposit across Europe and the Crusader states. Historians believe that they operated a kind of early banking system whereby funds could be deposited in one place and withdrawn in another, which would allow people such as, for example, merchants and pilgrims to transfer funds either for themselves to pick up somewhere else or to make payments without actually physically having to move coinage. So this was a very useful service that they provided. After its use by the Templars, the Temple Church was rented as by lawyers as a premises, and this is where the surrounding area came to be in use for barristers as it is today. So you have the Middle Temple and the Inner Temple, and that comes from the fact that lawyers rented these places and used them after the time of the Templars. So, having looked at what the Templars did, we can see that they did fulfill a very important role for the Crusader states. They provided a reliable army, they garrisoned castles and frontiers, provided counsel, assisted kings, and took a major part in crusades. They were undoubtedly fanatical warriors, among the elite troops of any army that the Crusader states could muster. And whenever the Muslims did actually fight them, they feared and hated them on account of their fanaticism. In fact, one example, when the Muslim general Saladin captured Templars in 1187, he had all the prisoners he'd captured beheaded rather than ransomed because they were such dangerous warriors to Islam. And often, though, if they lost a battle, the Templars would just not even be captured. They'd just go down fighting to the last man. This was not they were very useful for sure, but they also attracted criticism from their contemporaries. One example of this would be the fact that there was often rivalry between them and other military orders. Now, I haven't had time to go into the existence of other military orders, but basically there was one other major military order called the Knights Hospitaller. They basically emerged at a similar time as the Templars, and they fulfilled many of the same kinds of functions as the Templars. And they were another very big military order. As both of these two orders were very powerful, there was a certain amount of conflict between the two, and competition basically for land, political influence, and such. Sometimes the Templars and the other military orders would take part in political squabbles that took place at various times in the Crusader states, and contemporaries despaired that these actions made the Crusader states weaker and more vulnerable by contributing to factionalism, political factionalism and squabbling, rather than doing what they'd originally been formed to do, which was to provide military unwavering military support for the Crusader states. As they're only supposed to be accountable to the Pope, the relative immunity of the Templars from church authority, as I've mentioned before, caused them to be resented by some contemporaries who thought that they were given too much autonomy. And there were those that criticized them for acting in their own interests rather than in the interests of the Crusader states. There were those that criticized them for pride that was inimical to what they were originally set up for. They were supposed to be really the opposite of pride. They were supposed to be a humble order, and people felt that they'd got too proud due to the fact that they were very powerful at this point. They were sometimes also criticized for decisions that they made or advice they gave that turned out to be detrimental, such as advice given to Crusaders. Sometimes this criticism was fair, sometimes it wasn't. Most importantly, though, throughout the 13th century, some people simply thought that the order of the Temple had become too powerful. They argued that the Templars had gone from being the epitome of humility to having too much influence and being corrupted by greed and pride. This kind of criticism was not unique to the Templars. The same criticism of being too powerful was leveled against other religious orders such as the Benedictines and the Cistercians. However, the Templars were more vulnerable to this criticism, in large part because of the changing events in the Crusader states that would be happening by the end of the 13th century. So around the time that the Templars were starting to be criticized a lot more, the Crusader states were gradually falling apart. Why was this? Well, growing Muslim unity was played a big part in this. As I mentioned, at the time of the First Crusade, the Muslim forces had been relatively disunited. This was no longer the case, particularly since the time of Saladin in the late 1100s, the 1170s, 1180s. The Crusader states had started to be on the defensive. In the year 1250 specifically, there was a revolution in Egypt, and a Muslim dynasty called the Mamluk Sultanate became the new big political power. And they were hell-bent on wiping the Crusader states off the map for good. Soon enough, the Mamluks had actually managed to unite the forces of Egypt and Syria, so Egypt and Aleppo and Damascus. And this is something that Saladin managed to do before, but this unification would spell the end of the Crusader states ultimately. Weakened by internal infighting and also the petering out of large-scale crusading enterprises from the West, the Crusader states were now at the mercy of the Mamluk armies. So one by one, cities and castles, including the city of Jerusalem itself, fell over the course of the 13th century. Finally, in the year 1291, the coastal city of Acre, which is now in Israel, one of the most important of the cities in the Crusader states, fell to Mamluk forces. This was the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land to fall by military force. And the painting you see here is a 19th century romantic depiction of the Christians fighting atop the city walls against the attacking Mamluk forces. In the final Mamluk assault, with the walls breached, the Templars, along with the other military forces and Christian forces that were left at this time, fell almost to a man in the last desperate stand that was fought in the streets of Acre. The Grand Master of the Templars himself was killed in this fight. Some people managed to reach boats and escape by sea. Many of the remaining Templars retreated to the fortress on the city edge of Acre, where they held out and died and were annihilated. So with the loss of the Latin East, or the Crusader states in 1291, the Knights Templar had lost their raison d'etre. Ultimately, their mission to safeguard the Christian presence in the Holy Land had failed, and those who had already been criticizing them used this as ammunition to lay on further blame. The Templars were accused of not having fulfilled their primary duties and of allowing this loss of the Crusader states by weakening them through the political squabbling. This may have been partly true, but it was also unfair. The Templars were valiant warriors until the very end, and they played their part with courage. They had their weaknesses. They had been doing some of the things they'd been criticised for, but overall they were stout warriors. They played their part well. They supplemented the shortage of manpower well. Blame for the loss of the Crusader states must also be placed on other factors, namely on the Pope and European dynasties for being embroiled in their own political squabbles at this time and not sending reinforcements to aid the Crusader states when they most needed help, including the Pope, who was involved in shenanigans in Italy and was also to blame for this loss of the Crusader states by not coordinating a proper Crusader relief effort. So, even if the blame that was laid on the Templar Order was unfair, there is no doubt that the loss of the Crusader states in 1291 left them in a very precarious and vulnerable position. Their existence had been tied to Christian control of the Holy Land, and the loss of so many men, land, and castles had weakened them politically and financially. However, they still had a lot of property and land in Europe. So while the Templars settled on the nearby island of Cyprus and made plans for the recovery of the Holy Land, the king in France, who at this time was Philip IV, also known as Philip the Fair, was looking at the Templars' assets with a greedy eye. Not long after the loss of the Crusader states in the year 1307, he decided to accuse the Templars of heretical practices and to have them arrested. In doing this, he managed to convince the Pope, who was also a Frenchman called Clement V, to go along with this plan and give it the ecclesiastical legitimacy that he needed. A big reason for King Philip doing this was simply greed. He had expended huge sums of money on his wars with both England and Flanders, and he was cash-strapped basically and desperate for funds. He'd been exploiting every measure up to this point to squeeze taxes out of his subjects. His decision to destroy the Templar Order can be seen as an overall cynical plan for acquiring funds. And indeed, he did take full advantage, being a shrewd man, he took full advantage of the Templars' very vulnerable position at this point, choosing to strike when they were at their weakest. Furthermore, though, Philip did see himself as a very pious king, who was particularly concerned about suppressing heresy and heretical movements, which had been growing in the 13th century. So it's probable that he believed that he had a legitimate religious reasons for suppressing the Templars. So, across France, in one coordinated strike, the members of the Knights Templar were arrested in a series of surprise dawn raids in October of the year 1307. The arrested Templars were put in prison, and while they languished in prison, King Philip's lawyers and administrators prepared a series of formal charges to be raised against the order. Primarily, the most severe charges were that the Templars had engaged in sacrilegious activities during the initiation of new recruits to the order, namely that they had required initiates to spit on a crucifix and deny Christ, and also to kiss the brother that was receiving them at their reception in various places. It was claimed also that homosexuality was practiced among the brothers, and also that they worshipped a mysterious head. This comes up in the trial documents from the time. It's important to note that these charges were not completely novel. Similar charges had been made against heretics in the past, notably the accusation of sodomy, homosexual practices, idol worship, and denial of the cross. These had all been used against heretics in the past. So this should be considered within the context of the time, as Philip IV was concerned about heretical groups during this period. And basically, he was also exploiting popular fear of heretical groups at this time to help legitimize his suppression of the Templars. What is very striking, though, is that many of the Templars that were arrested by King Philip in France confessed to the charges that were leveled against them. But this was undoubtedly due to the torture that was employed, both physical torture and psychological torture, that was used to extract confessions from the Templars. And these confessions were exploited fully by skillful royal propaganda. So the fact that confessions were extracted from the confessions of the charges were extracted from so many Templars in France might suggest that there was some truth in King Philip's accusations against them. There may be a grain of truth. For example, it's very possible that some homosexual activity did occur among the Templars, as it probably did in other religious groups of the time, all male, as it might have done in all male religious groups. However, the scholarly consensus is that the Templars were generally not guilty of the most serious charges made against them. For one thing, there is no material evidence of guilt, so the investigators couldn't dredge up material evidence, for example, of the supposed heads that the Templars worshipped, and no heretical literature either was found when the royal officers searched the Templars' premises for anything incriminating. For another, the supposed confessions that were given by the brothers under torture were inconsistent. For example, when they confessed to venerating a head, they didn't give consistent descriptions of what the head was or what it looked like. So they were doing this because they were being tortured and they wanted the torture to stop. And also basically the supposed depositions that were made by witnesses against the Templars were the result of basically fanciful hearsay. So all in all, we can see that, you know, it wasn't these charges that were leveled against them didn't have any substance, really. And also, furthermore, as the Templars were present across Europe, the Pope also commanded the European kings outside France to arrest the Templars within their realms, including in England. Most Templars outside of France were not tortured, however, and accordingly, the vast majority denied the most serious accusations. So this would further lend credence to the idea that the only reason for their confession in France was the torture. Crucially, though, the Templars were not in a good position to defend themselves against the charges. They didn't have many trained lawyers, for example, to mount a legal defense. They weren't men of letters particularly. They didn't have a great knowledge of canon law, which was church law. They were not particularly scholarly. So their ignorance of many of this and their lack of legal expertise hampered the ability of the Templars to defend themselves, and also the fact that they were tortured both physically and psychologically hampered their ability to defend themselves. So, despite the fact that the charges against the Templars were basically a put-up job to seize their assets, the Pope went along with the French king. He issued a papal proclamation in 1312, which formally dissolved the Order of the Knights Templar everywhere, and ordered that in most cases their property should pass to the Knights Hospitaller, which were one of the other military order, the other big military order. As you can imagine, the French king was reluctant to transfer these properties over to the Knights Hospitaller because the reason for suppressing them was partly because he wanted their assets. But eventually this was done for the most part, and the Templar properties were given over to the Knights Hospitaller. As for the Templar brothers themselves, most of them were absolved by the church. Many of them were pensioned off, allowed to join other. They were pensioned off or allowed to join other religious orders, such as the Cistercians. Some of them died under torture, particularly in France, and some died whilst in prison. A small minority, among them the Grand Master, who's called Jacques de Molay, were burned at the stake. This was because they later retracted their original confessions and denied the charges against them. But in the eyes of, because they originally confessed under torture and now they were trying to mount some kind of defense and protect the reputation of their order. However, in the eyes of the church, this made them relapsed heretics and liable to execution. So they were, the Grand Master and some others were actually burned at the stake in France, and this is a depiction of that, which scholarly consensus would suggest that it was a sad and undignified end for men who'd been of such high reputation formerly. And I'm aware that I am going over time a little bit, apologies. Finally, we're going to address some of the pseudo-history. So the Knights Templar were dissolved in 1312, but how has history actually treated them? There have been a lot of theories and speculations about the Templars in the centuries since that they were dissolved in 1312. Some of this comes from Romantic literature, which actually goes back to the Middle Ages during the time of the Templars themselves. One of the most prominent examples of this Romance literature is a popular work by the medieval German poet Wolfram von Eschenbach, which is about the story of Sir Percival, one of the Arthurian knights of the Round Table. The story focuses on the adventures of Sir Percival. Within it, a group that one could see as being like the Templars appears in a fictionalized way. They're called Templars, so you can link it to the idea that he was likening them to the Templars. They're portrayed in a fictionalized way as guardians who protect the Holy Grail in this particular story. So the association between the Templars and the Holy Grail comes from their inclusion in this work of Romantic literature. And that association between that incorrect association between the Templars and the supposed Holy Grail has persisted through the centuries. The Templars in medieval Romance literature were generally portrayed in a positive way as virtuous and chivalric warriors, interestingly, which suggests that their standing and respect in popular imagination among the minds of the people who composed and read these works was of high regard. People regarded them highly, even while some people were criticizing them of pride. And even after the order was suppressed, in fact, there was a kind of romantic, sort of nostalgic view of the Templars for a time as these sort of chivalric paragons of knightly virtue. On the other hand, the Templars have also been portrayed as sinister characters, and to do this, the accusations that were originally, the sham accusations that were made in the trials have been dredged up to support this view. So, for example, an Austrian historian in the 19th century revived the idea that the Templars had worshipped heads and idols. Another example is Sir Walter Scott, who in Ivanhoe and in the Talisman portrays the Templars. In these works, they're portrayed as flawed and sinister characters, sort of antagonists in the books. Although in Scott's particular case, we might see this reflecting contemporary British Protestant sort of antagonism towards a Catholic order rather than Scott's personal views against the Templars. The main point is that the Templars' reputation has been very malleable, and they have been used in a positive and negative way based on one hand, they were sort of lauded as a group that was doing a spiritual knightly thing. And on the other hand, people have looked at these trial documents and dredged up this idea that they worshipped heads and engaged in occult, sinister practices. So it's been very malleable. They've been used both ways. I'll just quickly note the link between the Templars and Freemasonry stems from the 18th century. A Scottish writer and Freemason living in France named Andrew Ramsay claimed in the 1700s that the history of Freemasonry actually went back to stonemasons who worked in the Crusader states. Although Ramsay didn't explicitly mention the Templars, other Masons who were based in Germany developed the idea that the Templars had sort of discovered or inherited mysterious secrets or treasure during their time in Jerusalem, perhaps, and that their sort of esoteric knowledge had been passed between the stonemasons and Templars at this point, and this started this idea that the Templars were in possession of some kind of secret treasure or knowledge. And this idea although it has no historical basis, has persisted through the centuries to the present day, really. So despite the fact that the Templars were not actually what some have claimed that they were, ideas about secret knowledge and treasure has persisted into modern times, resulting in a number of popular books, some of which I'm sure you've heard of, such as, well, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. It was one particular noted work which goes back to this perceived Grail link. Speculations continue to be made about whether the Templars had treasure that they'd hidden somewhere, or whether they'd found or inherited secret knowledge, which and even that this kind of secret knowledge had forced the church to suppress them, and this is why they'd been suppressed. Even if these ideas can't be proved otherwise, they don't have any historical or evidential basis. As a quick postscript, if we actually look at the inventories of Templar property that were made by the crown in France and in other countries when the Templars were arrested, surveying their goods and assets, we can see from these documents that they don't reveal any evidence of having mysterious objects or indeed anything like that. In fact, what they actually suggest is that the Templars were fairly orthodox, pious Catholics who remained true to their vocation, and far from participating in secret initiation rites and occultic practices, were quite normal, sort of pious people who were maybe not particularly literate or learned, but were actually humble in terms of their personal effects. Despite the fact that they had a lot of power, and despite the fact that they had a lot of assets, their actual personal effects were relatively humble. Nonetheless, stories about the Grail and such, and the Freemasons, make for very good literature and books, and will no doubt continue to be circulated and published for the foreseeable future. Thank you very much.